Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the summer 2022 Roper Roundtable. I appreciate you taking the time to join us. We have an exciting presentation today. I'm Henry Smith. I'm the marketing specialist here at the Roper Center for Public Opinion Research. And we're excited today to have a presentation on civic engagement and Roper iPoll. And it's my pleasure to introduce Robert Shapiro, who's the Wallace Sayre Professor of Government and Professor of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, as well as Kathleen Weldon, the Roper Center Director of Data Operations and Communications here at the center. And they're gonna be talking here and presenting on civic engagement. From quick housekeeping notes, if you don't mind, there's going to be a Q&A session at the end, so I encourage everybody to participate in that. Well, I'm going to keep people's microphones muted during this presentation. If you want to ask questions, please ask them in the Q&A. Write them out there, and then we'll present them at the end of the presentation. I'll also unmute people's microphones if you simply raise your hand. We'll go over that at the end. But as your questions come up, write them in Q&A if you would, and then we'll present them at the end. And so we are recording this presentation. I just want to let everyone know that. And thanks again for joining us. And I'll turn it over to Robert Shapiro. Morning, Robert.
Good morning, Henry. Good morning, Kathleen. Thank you for inviting me to speak today on one of my favorite subjects. Actually, I'm a longtime user of the Roper Center data and Roper iPoll, which Kathleen will be telling you more about later. Also, in the spirit of truth in advertising, I'm also the chair of the board of directors of the Roper Center. So I'm a big supporter of the organization, and I've been that for a very long time. Going back to when I was in graduate school, when I did research on the relationship between public opinion and policy, where as part of the project we acquired a substantial portion of the what we call the top line holdings of the Roper Center. Now, back in those days, we got the data in paper form, not electronic form. So that kind of dates me historically. But it just goes to show my excitement in using the Roper Center data and also talking about it. Now, the topic today is civic engagement and Roper iPoll. Now, for me, civic engagement is a very broad term, and it really speaks to what's been my longstanding interest, the study of the history of public opinion, and in particular, public opinion in the context of American democracy. Now, when I think of polling, when a lot of people think of polling, they think of information about public opinion that governments could respond to if they wanted to. And in fact, when polling began in earnest in its current social scientific form in 1935, George Gallup, who was one of the first major pollsters in the United States, basically was a big proponent of polling. It was his business, so he had a vested interest in this. But he argued very persuasively that by doing polling, polls provided information to political leaders and governments that those governments and political leaders, well, from his standpoint, should respond to, but I would say could respond to. And we can say should respond to in the sense that governments should be doing what the public wants, and if they have information about what the public wants, they should use that information to deliberate over and enact policies. Now, there's a lot of tension there. That is very few people would claim that government should automatically respond to what the polls say, or even do what the people want based on other information that they have. And there's a big tension in that regard about polling and democracy. But while Gallup argued that polls could be used by policymakers to enact policies that were consistent with public opinion, and that should be one of the hallmarks of democracy, we can agree in principle that for democracy to exist, the government should a lot of the time be in sync with what the public wants, either being influenced by what the public wants, or being able to just persuade the public that what they're doing is right, and have the public come around to their particular views. Now, just from a pure empirical standpoint, Gallup made his claim about how polls, should and would enable governments to respond to public opinion. Well, that has not been the case. And the history of research on the relationship between public opinion and policy does in fact show, on the one hand, that there's a correlation, if you will, with government policies and what the public wants. Early studies showed that, one of the first studies, persuasive ones, showed that at about 64% of the time, majority public opinion was responded to by governments. And another study showed about the same proportion of the time, when changes in public opinion occurred, changes in government policies followed. But there's been a debate about to what extent that represents a causal effect of public opinion on policymaking, rather than the public coming around to what government leaders wanted, what they were saying, and what they did. And then after the fact, government leaders could point to the fact that, yeah, the public was getting what they wanted a lot of the time. Now notice 64% is not perfect. It's not 100%, and that might, we can debate whether that's enough to fulfill that particular kind of standard for democracy. Later studies showed that studying the correlation between public opinion and policies in other ways showed that's a pretty robust finding. There's a lot of correlation between what governments do and what the public wants, but it's imperfect. Some of the critiques of that kind of research about public opinion and policymaking is twofold. One is there have been recent studies that showed that this responsiveness is not responsiveness to what the public as a whole wants, but there's inequality in responsiveness. That is, governments are responding more to the opinions of rich people than middle-class people or poor people. The other critique of this is that any kind of correspondence between public opinion and policymaking might not necessarily be something that we would call democratic. That is, what may be going on there is that the public is being influenced by political leaders in ways in which they could be, they could be misled by political leaders and manipulated by political leaders, so that political leaders are getting what they wanted in the way of government policy in a fashion that's not responsive to autonomous public opinion, but it's public opinion that they've molded and shaped and perhaps misled in ways that we would not necessarily call democratic. And on the other hand, this correspondence may not produce the wisest of all policies. That is, we need to evaluate the quality of public opinion and the quality of policies before we make any judgments about whether or not what we find is something that we want to call democratic. That's democratic with a little d. That is, there's a difference between public opinion and policymaking and democracy per se. There are other requirements that have to do with the quality of public opinion. And the quality of public opinion hinges on the quality of the information that the public's getting and how that information changes over time, and the quality of those changes in information. And a lot of that information, obviously, it's coming through the mass media. It goes without saying, but the initiators of all this and the focus of all this tends to be what is happening in politics and what political leaders are saying and doing. So the quality of public opinion being dependent on the quality of information is really dependent on the quality of the information coming from political leaders. That is, leadership is important. And a famous political scientist, one of my heroes named D.O. Key Jr., argued that you really can't talk about democracy without looking at public opinion and policymaking, but also looking at the leadership that's involved in this kind of process as well. In addition to that, from the standpoint of civic engagement, there are a lot of other requirements of democracy beyond public opinion and policymaking and leaders, and that has to do with the importance of the protection of rights and civil liberties, and also, well, in the case of the United States, we can talk about certain important American values, and then more recently, and this wasn't always a discussion inherent in discussions about democracy in the United States, but in today's highly partisan, polarized world of American politics, we're now talking about support for free and fair elections and the rule of law and those kinds of things as well. And so when Gallup argued that polls were important in terms of taking the pulse of the public, and he wrote a book called The Pulse of Democracy, the existence of polling has not led to the flourishing of democracy in the United States and elsewhere. But what it has done is provided the ability of studying, looking at public opinion comparing it to what governments do, and looking at to what extent government policies are responding to public opinion. But also, we can also look at the quality of those opinions as well. We can study things like how much, or to what extent is the public knowledgeable about a wide array of political issues, to the point that we think that the opinions that they form based on the information they have is something worthy. That is, those opinions are worthy of being responded to. And in addition, when we talk about these other dimensions of democracy, support for rights and liberties, and nowadays support for the rule of law and free and fair elections, those are the kinds of things that could be studied with public opinion polls. We can actually study to what extent the public is supportive of rights and liberties and American values. And I just want to go over one very important case in point that kind of illustrates that what one can learn from public opinion in this kind of thinking about democracy. We're all waiting with bated breath for the Supreme Court's final decision on Roe versus Wade. Now, the case of abortion in the United States was a case that studies have shown that changes in government policy occurred hand in hand with changes in public opinion. That is, from the earliest polls on abortion in the 1960s through the time of Roe versus Wade in 1972 to 1973, there was a sizable change in the pro-choice direction. That is, there was increasing support for allowing women to have legal abortions. Now, this was reflected also in the fact that state governments were relaxing their restrictions on abortion as well. That is, there's a pretty clear consensus that the country, at least from the standpoint of public opinion, was moving in a more liberal pro-choice direction, and state policies were moving in that direction. So by the time Roe versus Wade decision occurred, that decision was basically inconsistent with changes in public opinion that occurred, and increases in support, majority support for allowing abortion, at least in a great many circumstances. There were tensions about what extent abortion might need to be regulated in certain ways. But at the time that Roe versus Wade was enacted, I would argue that the Supreme Court got it about right. That is, they picked where the midpoint of public opinion was. Now, what happened thereafter was that public opinion remained stunningly stable concerning attitudes toward abortion. And you can go through the Roper Center data holdings, or you can go online and look at the NORC General Social Survey trend data on attitudes toward abortion. And you really see that opinion is strikingly stable. But what happened after Roe versus Wade is that the issue became increasingly partisan. Now, at the time of Roe versus Wade, and then you can look at the data, and it's really quite extraordinary. Around 1972 to 1973, the partisan differences, the difference between Democrats and Republicans and self-identified independents on abortion, were strikingly similar. If anything, Republicans were slightly more pro-choice than Democrats. What happened thereafter is that the parties began to become divided. That is, at the level of political leadership and the grassroots movements in both parties. The parties separated. That is, the Democratic Party became the pro-choice party, and the Republican Party became the pro-life party. But you might be scratching your head. I said public opinion was stable thereafter. Yeah, public opinion was stable thereafter, but it was stable in the context of Republicans becoming increasingly pro-life and Democrats becoming increasingly pro-choice, and those movements in opposite directions canceled each other out. So you had sort of a flattish line. I mean, it's not flat. It kind of jumps up and down due to sampling error and things of that sort, or short-term changes in public opinion. But what was striking is opinion was stable in the context of increasing partisan conflict. Now, you wouldn't know about that partisan conflict unless you saw analyses of survey data that showed the partisan differences, or you actually looked at them yourselves using those data. And it's something you can actually do using iPoll. Kathleen Weldon can perhaps talk further about that. But it's that process of discovery of what underlies public opinion that makes the availability of public opinion data so valuable, and why it makes the holdings of the Roper Center, in my opinion, much more important. Now, politics aside, we can talk about civic engagement more broadly, to include engagement outside of politics, that basically in social life and economic life and things of that sort. And from survey data, you can learn about all manner of political attitudes outside politics, attitudes toward different aspects of popular culture, the arts, sciences, those kinds of things as well, or even sports as well. So that these survey data provide information about all manner of things, and they do so in attempting to do so in a very scientific or social scientific fashion. And from the standpoint of civic engagement and democracy, it's important for democracies to allow the free flow and availability of that kind of information without any kinds of restrictions. Now, there have been some restrictions that have been imposed on polling, especially outside the United States. In parts of Latin America and Europe, during election periods, they restrict what extent public polls can be reported. So there are debates about reporting of polling leading to political conflict or uncertainty, or all kinds of things that are undesirable. So they put limits on polling, and we can talk about that further in the Q&A. But from the standpoint of free speech, a free press, having information about public opinion is in general very important. And in a democracy, if we want to look at at one standard being what extent governments do things that are in sync with public opinion, having public opinion data available allow for that kind of comparison. And to the extent that politicians deviate from public opinion, and democracy doesn't require, in my view, that politicians do what the public wants. In my view, it requires that political leaders attempt to lead and educate the public. And if they do things that are at odds with public opinion, that's perfectly fine and acceptable. That is, the public is not all knowing. We depend on leaders for information and for their judgment. And leaders sometimes fall short in that respect, as we've seen in current politics, no matter what your partisan perspective is. But having polls available can force leaders to explain why it is they deviate from public opinion. So there's a lot of explaining that's been going on with regard to what may be happening on the issue of abortion. But on the case of abortion, we've got now divided public opinion in a way that it wasn't divided during the time of Roe versus Wade. And that explains a lot about what's been happening in current politics. But having this kind of information available, and I'm just going to quit on this point, is something that I think is very important for a vibrant and normatively acceptable democracy. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. Appreciate that. Before I turn it over to Kathleen, I just want to make a quick announcement. You'll notice in the chat that we're enabling access to iPoll today, and you're welcome to distribute that link to your colleagues. But if you're interested in accessing iPoll and don't currently have access, you can go through that link in the chat and get access. And Kathleen, you are up.
Thank you. And thank you, Bob, for that lovely overview and that testament to the importance of what we do at the Roper Center. I am going to share my screen here. I have a bit of PowerPoint going. There we go. So I'm going to give a really 10,000-foot view of the Roper Center for those of you who are not familiar with what we do here. Those of you who are may find some of this stuff you already know, but feel free to ask any questions, and you may learn about new things that we've been doing that you haven't heard about. So the Roper Center is the oldest social science data archive in the world. We were the first place where social science data was shared to allow analysis and reuse of data and to ensure preservation. Our mission has always had these two roles, right? These two parts to it. Part of it is about the preservation and making sure that these things are available to researchers now and into the future. But the other part is to promote the understanding of public opinion. And we do this through educational events, through our website, and other outreach around public opinion survey research and why it matters. There are two ways that most people access the Roper Center, either through Roper iPoll, which is what I'm going to show you today, or through the America's Voice Project, which is a version of Roper iPoll that is available to public libraries. So what is a data archive? In most people's lives, it's not something that comes up, but it's very important. We have 23,000 data sets. That means, by data set, that means the individual respondent level data. That means you can look at those pieces of public opinion that Bob was discussing in terms of party ID, but also in terms of gender, of race or ethnicity, of age. You can break down the demographic groups or see what opinions are correlated with other opinions. Where did questions work together? That is all available through our collection of data sets. But we also have this database of questions and what we refer to in polling as top-line results, which is to say the things that you see in the news, what the total sample of a poll responded to a particular question. There are actually, we're just shy today. I was saying, I think we're going to break it today, 820,000 questions in this database. The vast majority of these are US questions, and the vast majority of these are US national questions, going back all the way to the dawn of polling in 1935. And continuing through today, we update iPoll daily based on the press releases that come out that day. And so you will see very quick turnaround. Things are very up to date, and it's also quite comprehensive. It covers all of the major media polls. It's a massive resource. Just a few of the organizations in iPoll. So there are over 1,200. That's what happens when you're around for this many years. It's our 75th anniversary. So this is a list of some of the currently organizations providing data to the center. But we have many, many more if you go back in time. And you can see that these represent media organizations, academic organizations, commercial organizations, nonprofits and think tanks, these sorts of organizations, which each have a different role in a democracy, and each have found a value in having public opinion data. There we go. So people who are using the question bank, the database, can learn a lot, not just about opinions and attitudes, but also about what people do, what they've experienced, what's happened to them in the past, what they're hoping for the future, their knowledge. There are knowledge questions that test the public's knowledge, and questions where they self-report their knowledge. It's a broad range of approaches that you can get through that, what we put into the umbrella of public opinion, but it's beyond public opinion in some senses. It's also what the things that individuals report that shape that opinion that are often included in the surveys as we try to understand how and why people hold the opinions that they do. We have state level questions. This is a relatively new addition to the Roper Center. We have about 15,000 state level questions that have been added from the past 5 years or so. And this is really important because state government is sometimes where the rubber really hits the road. There's a lot of policy that is state specific, and looking at national questions does not give you a true understanding of the level of support for a particular policy that's being enacted at the state level. So we are adding many, many more state questions every day. And this is an example here with the questions around gun policy in Texas, which we all know makes national news, but you need to know what Texans think about that. We have some crosstabs. So if we have that data set, if we have the data set that I mentioned in terms of individual respondents, we can run what we call crosstabs, which is to say we can break them down by those demographic groups and look at that, and we can see where the splits are. So for example, there's a huge split between the parties on building a wall to stop illegal immigration. It's absolutely massive. It's terribly polarized, and I will leave it to Bob to discuss that at more length if he wishes to. But finding those places is incredibly informative and very helpful, and it's right there in iPoll. You can also see where people agree. Sometimes it can be a bit of a surprise, given how polarized the country is, how many things people do agree on. Something like this: the country should do more to help former members of the armed forces transition back to normal life. Everyone's in complete agreement. This is almost no one is saying that they even somewhat disagree. As Bob mentioned, tracking change in public opinion over time is a core use of the Roper Center iPoll database. So here we have polls drawn from many different organizations that fielded the same exact question: do you think the use of marijuana should be made legal or not? And by looking at all of those together, you can track changes in this responses to this question among national adults from 1969 to today. And that's very helpful if you're looking at that question of when do policies get enacted in relation to where does public opinion change. You can see the massive change in public opinion on this question. So for those of you who would be using the public side of the site, who may not have a relationship with a membership organization or public library that is involved with a Roper Center, there are many resources on the website. And then again, this is part of our educational mission. So I'm going to run a little video here so that it moves through the screens. But starting at our website, if you go to the data highlights page, you can see some of the items that we have available, information about topics that are covered in polling, all the subjects that are part of the big public debate in America. What you see is writing about it, graphs about it, descriptions of data sets that have a lot of information. We also have much information about elections and presidents. We have the presidential approval tract going all the way back to Roosevelt. And we have the exit polls, which provide us information on demographic breakdowns among voters. We also have a section on featured collections. So these are sort of specialized collections, and there's very interesting history involved there. And finally, we have polling fundamentals, understanding polls. And I'm not going to step into the Q&A quite because I would like to let Bob do that. But evaluating polls is a hugely important part of what we can allow users to do. We do it partly by providing educational materials like these, but we also do it through disclosure and transparency. So if you are in Roper iPoll looking at recent data, you will see the Transparency Project transparency scoring, which indicates what information has been provided with a data set to the Roper Center in terms of methodology, in terms of the organizations that paid for, designed, fielded the poll, in terms of the sample, so the precise sample, when it was fielded exactly. Things change based on things that change in the news, and you need that information. And we follow the recommendations of the professional organizations in polling, the primary ones, which are the American Association for Public Opinion Research and the World Association for Public Opinion Research, or APOR and WAPOR, they have set standards for disclosure that surveys should meet. So the question that came up in Q&A is, how do you evaluate? There are many layers to that question, and it's not simple, certainly, but one core requirement is that the surveys meet these standards, that they're sharing the information, the very basic information that you need to know, the exact question wording, not just a description of the question wording, the exact dates, the exact sample. Is this national adults? Is it Texans? Is it likely voters? Those are very different groups. So we make sure that not only do we have this extensive information about methodology for data sets, but every question, even if it's pulled from public press release that's put into that database, has at least that core information. Every piece tells you who was asked exactly, even if they had to go through a filter question, like if they were asked, if they voted in the last election and then answered a follow-up question, as well as the field dates, the dates that the actual interviewing occurred, the size of the sample, the organizations involved. So that is my overview of iPoll. I am happy to answer any questions about our collection or the interface that we have built on the collection to allow people to use it and to see the questions and the data. But I am also planning to hand this back to questions for Bob about civic engagement. So let me just stop staring at my screen here.
Thank you, Kathleen. So from a housekeeping perspective, we've got a couple questions in Q&A. You're welcome to submit more if you want to write your questions in Q&A. Also, if you want to raise your hand, I'm happy to unmute your microphone and we can have you speak the question as well. But the first question, actually, I'll ask this of Bob. The question was asked, does opinion research exist in non-democratic countries?
Yes. Basically, survey research exists in all manner of countries. Now surveys are broadly defined. That is, for example, all countries do some form of census of their populations, and that's a kind of survey. It's not an attitude political survey, which is what you're getting at. But survey research exists in that context. Also, just from an economic and social standpoint, surveys are done by political scientists and social scientists in those countries to study attitudes and behavior of different sort. And the question is, in authoritarian countries, are they allowed to cross the line to deal with more political kinds of things? But also in all these countries, and whether they're capitalist or not, they're vibrant. All countries aspire to have vibrant economies. There's all kinds of market research that's done in different countries to deal with economic demand and supply and information to help the economy move along and help businesses prosper and so forth. So survey research is kind of alive and well everywhere, and people in these countries, travel to European and countries in the U.S. and Canada and elsewhere to learn about survey research and public opinion research, and then they learn things here, then go back to their countries and apply those kinds of things. But with regard to what you're getting at, Henry, the sensitive questions, the answer is all governments have an incentive to get information about public opinion. I think there's a widespread adage in a lot of countries that in all manner of countries, the people may fear their governments, but the governments also fear the people. And governments have an incentive to understand what the public is thinking from the standpoint of learning about how fearful should they be of their publics, and what should they be doing to deal with those kinds of things. And a really good case in point is what's been happening in Russia today with regard to the war in Ukraine. They're widespread. The current finding in Russian public opinion is that Vladimir Putin is very popular, and there is substantial support for the war. And everyone's wondering, is that really accurate opinion, or people saying that because that's politically and socially acceptable? And the best social science information is that from the research center that does the polls and that's permitted to do the polls, and the fact that they're permitted obviously may make it suspect, is that those poll results are pretty accurate. That is, there's a certain degree of nationalism in Russia that's been reflected there, and Putin has had widespread support. Now, it could be the case that people in those polls, and we don't, and this is where the transparency and full disclosure is important. We don't know whether it's the case that people who are not, there's non-response bias going on there, and the people who are unfavorable toward the government of the war don't respond to the polls. And that's one thing we need to take with a grain of salt. But the governments have an incentive to actually have good polling done, so they really know what's going on in the public's mind. They may not want to publicize, have the results publicized, and it's the freedom of speech and freedom of the press aspect that we need to pay attention to there.
Very good. Another person asked, and this actually may be a two-part question. Kathleen started this, and you may want to address specific things in iPoll, but the question was, how does someone new to this data learn and understand what makes a survey a good one? How can we sift through the noise, and who and how? This is a little broken. How can we sift through the noise, and is there noise in survey research? And how can we sift through all that and find out who and how is generating that noise? So how does someone new to this data learn to understand what makes a survey a good one?
Okay, I think both Kathleen and I should respond to this. And Kathleen actually also as part of her discussion, started it. But let me just give you my take on this. First of all, I think the questioner used the word noise in survey data, which was a very polite term. So even survey researchers think about sources of error in surveys. Okay, so there's the issue of error. To learn about sources of error, one could go to various resources available. I'm not quite sure to what extent the Roper Center has reports online that Kathleen would refer people to, but APOR, the American Association for Public Opinion Research, has documents that talk directly about this, and these are freely available. A lot of the survey organizations post their own things on this, but you can learn about different sources of error. What's very important, this is the first cut, and this is what Kathleen talked about. The first thing to be aware of is that to the extent that polls should be thought of as legitimate and something that one could have some confidence looking at, transparency is very important. The first question we should ask is the pollster transparent with regard to its methods, its question wordings, how it draws its samples, and so forth. So transparency is very important. Kathleen talked about how the Roper Center has been dealing directly with that. Now, transparency doesn't automatically mean the polls are good, but at least you have a fighting chance of learning about what the methods are. And then with regard to sources of error and noise, there are just a lot of sources of error. The biggest one is, to what extent is the sample that one obtains representative? That's the sampling coverage is very important. And then there's sampling error, which is most common form of noise, and that's sort of easy. You can kind of estimate that for probability samples, but that's a relatively minor source of error compared to the coverage of the representativeness of the survey in terms of coverage, the effects of question wording. There are things that could occur due to the order of questions in surveys, errors caused by interviewers being better than others. So there are various sources of errors that one can learn about. The good news is you can learn about them. To what extent that they're having effects on poll results depend on experiments that survey researchers do to see to what extent their results are sensitive to certain methodological issues. Kathleen, what's your further take on this?
Just another plug for archiving. One way that you can think about whether a poll is likely to be good, let's just put it in a vague way, is, does it look like that the opinion expressed in the poll, did some questions in the poll look anything like other polling done by other organizations on the same issue? You're not going to see massive differences unless there's massive differences in question wording, different topics being addressed. So getting information from more than one poll and compiling that and getting a sense of where things stand really helps you sort of get your footing before you try to evaluate a single poll. You know, one outlier doesn't make a change in opinion. Two questions in time don't make a trend. You really need to look at more. And that's part of what the iPoll database allows us to do. It gives us the historical context, also gives us the current context with everything pulled together and easier to see. So that's one piece. The second piece I would say is, are the organizations doing any education themselves? Most, as Bob said, most of the good organizations that are really dedicated to quality work will put out information on their website. The people associated with it publish. They're involved with our professional organizations. They go to the conferences. They learn about the problems. They're interested enough in maintaining quality that they put effort into that, both what they bring into their organization in terms of the education of their own people, but also what they put out in terms of education of the general public, of other researchers through peer publications, and journalists, because journalists obviously are the filter through which most polls are received by the public. And so it's very important that journalists have a good sense of the answers to the question, what makes a good poll? So those would be the two things I would think about that, that Bob didn't address yet.
But let me add a couple things. Kathleen's
Yes,
points
please.
are well taken about, comparing polls by different organizations and different question wordings. This is where iPoll is very useful, because you can, if you see a recent poll report in the media, if you really wanted to dig into it, you can go into iPoll, research the topic, looking at different question wordings, different survey organizations, and you can get a sense of the range of public opinion across organizations and across different kinds of wordings of questions. And then the other issue, in terms of evaluating polls, the survey research world is almost like sort of like the Wild West these days. That is, there are different polling methods being used. There are the traditional, what the Roper Center calls long-standing polling methods, the kind of standard ones using random digit dialing and telephone surveys and maybe voter lists or something like that. But they're now these recently developed methods that fall under the categories of non-probability samples, or the use of interactive voice response, kinds of polls, and that raises all kinds of questions. And that's where transparency is very important. And what the Roper Center now does is it distinguishes between these long-standing methods, polls, versus these more recently developed methods.
It's slightly tangential to this, but expanding on this, Mark Zwellig in Toronto asked, given the quality and number of opinion polls, how do you account for the public's skepticism about polls and the public's poor opinion of pollsters? And very anecdotally, I was at a birthday party over the weekend and somebody expressed skepticism about polling, and they were conflating the journalists who were reporting on the polls with the quality of the polls themselves. That's very anecdotal.
Oh, no. I think there's a very clear answer to the question, and you've touched on it in terms of the journalists and the polls and the polls themselves. But when you ask people about polls, are they talking about public opinion, attitudinal polls in general, or is polling really election polls and voting? And it's the election polls that have been ridden with error, that have been that are really quite apparent. It's actually the reason why a lot of foreign governments limit the reporting of polls near election day, because of the errors in the polls and the kinds of questions and the disruption those kinds of results cause. But we've seen in the United States that there have been all kinds of problems in election polling. APOR has done successive studies of the sources of error in these polls, and the pollsters thought they had figured out the problem after 2016, but they evidently hadn't. The adjustments that were made in polls in 2020 led to it didn't work. The sources of error were substantial. Well, actually, the errors were in state polls. That's where the problem was. And then and so we can talk more about that, but I think that was all quite clear. And then the other controversy has been about the quality of exit polls in the United States. In a lot of countries around the world, the exit polling is really strikingly reliable. In the U.S., there have been biases that crept in. One of the former chairs of the board of directors of the Roper Center was Warren Matofsky, who was the father of exit polls, and even he, at the end, basically tried to explain that there have been errors in the exit polls having to do with non-response bias in terms of to what extent certain kinds of people would not fill out exit poll questionnaires, and that led to bias. And the source of error is that it was basically Republican voters have been a little shy to respond to exit polls, and that's produced all kinds of problems with the exit polls, to the point where the exit polls are not used as extensively as they used to be used to project election results. And certainly, we would not want to compare exit poll results to the election results to gauge whether the election results are accurate, as is done in other countries. And even the exit polls results themselves, data themselves, have to be weighted to the vote, the actual vote, before they can be used for further research, looking at correlations between things. And then the Roper Center archives those data with the weights that one has to use to make valid use of those polls.
This is, I think, a question for Kathleen. Somebody asked if I see a headline on the news, can I come to your site and see if it's there, or if there's other data there to confirm what I heard?
Well, today you certainly can. As mentioned, we have full open access to the question database today. Otherwise, if you are an institutional member associated with an institution that is an institutional member, a university, a media organization, you would have access. And we also have access made available through some public libraries through the America's Voice Project. And we're really hoping that that grows, in part because we really feel it's important that the people who answer these polls have access to this resource. The public opinion should be available to the public. So we have been working with public libraries, and will continue to do so, to expand that program to make it more available. Otherwise, what you'll likely see is maybe some historical material, some writing about the topic, but you won't see that day to day. These are all the questions that were asked in the last week. Where there is more access is in the realm of health. We do support a subset of iPoll in what we call the health poll database. And if you go to that does have in a certain amount of free access. And this is a media model. You get certain number of question views a month, unlimited searches, certain number of question views. And there are trend lines available there, including some public trends. So you could grab that marijuana legalization chart. You could take a look at that and interact with that, play around with the different organizations, see whether you think pulling out the face-to-face interviews changes the tracking. So there are options, but we're hoping to expand them more.
I'll just answer this quick question. It looks like we're recording the roundtable. We're recording this roundtable. The recording will be available via ropercenter.cornell.edu, which is the homepage of the Roper Center. Will also be on our YouTube channel, as well as a number of other presentations and informational videos that we've created there on finding information in iPoll using features and functions. So ropercenter.cornell.edu. Again, access to iPoll is currently available through the link that's in the chat. And so feel free to distribute that to your colleagues as you wish. There are currently no other hands raised. There are no other questions in the Q&A. Would you all like to wrap up here, or I'll put it out there that we can take questions. I'm happy to unmute your microphones if anybody wants to ask a question live. Simply raise your hand and I will do that.
Can I just chime in on a couple things?
Absolutely, Bob.
Okay, well, first of all, I just want to reiterate what Kathleen said about the importance of making information about public opinion available to the public. I think that's really, I think that's sort of the central theme of this session as I see it. And then the other thing I just want to point out in some of the data that Kathleen presented, using the Roper Center data, you can kind of dig further into some of the issues that she presented. For example, she showed the increasing support for the border wall and trends and attitudes toward immigration. Back in 1998, when I've seen some of the earliest data, back then there were no partisan differences in attitudes toward immigration. It was not a partisan issue. And then on the marijuana trend, that too, there wasn't much in the way of partisan differences as well. But the difference between the two issues is that on immigration, Democrats and Republicans have tended to move in opposite directions, whereas with regard to attitudes toward marijuana legalization, both Democrats and Republicans have become increasingly, pro-legalization, but the Democrats have moved faster. So there's a wider partisan gap on that kind of issue. But it's that kind of subtlety that's possible to get information about from the Roper Center holdings.
Very good, Bob. Folks, I want to acknowledge also the support of Civic Season and Made by US. I'll put a link here in the chat that gets you to Civic Season and talks about their support. But we made this event especially to support their efforts and opening the archive in support of Civic Season and Made by US's efforts to basically promote civics and civic engagement in the US. And their event, their season runs from Juneteenth to the 4th of July. And they're really looking to drive civic engagement across a huge number of platforms. So if you're interested in that information, look in the chat for a hyperlink. And they have a huge amount of resources that are available to further this discussion as well. Kathleen, is there anything you'd like to wrap up with?
I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to get to hear from Bob, so I greatly enjoyed it. And if you ever have questions about the holdings of the Roper Center, we are very responsive. Drop us an email or give us a call, and we can help you determine if there is data to address any sort of question that you might have.
Bob, thank you very much for your time, and everyone, thank you for attending today. This concludes our presentation, and we appreciate your time. There's a link to Civic Season, civicsseason.com, thecivicsseason.com/get started. Thank you all for your time, and we look forward to hearing from you. Have a good day.
Okay.